Dear viewers, today get ready to dive into the dark corridors of history. We're going to a time when a shadow loomed over the hearts of people around the world, casting fear. It was an invisible threat, yet everyone could feel it. A nightmare nourished by legends, passed down from generation to generation. Today we will discuss the days when witch trials and witch hunts ruled, and where reason was replaced by fear. Witch hunts were like a dark cloud hanging over innocent people. Many believed that these so-called witches, thought to possess supernatural powers, were dragging the world into chaos. Whispers of these rumors echoed at every street corner, in every town square, planting seeds of fear in the minds of the people. But how did such a wave of madness spread? Who were these witches? Who were the hunters chasing them? And who ignited this incredible era? Now let's take a step back into those old days together. Let's move towards the villages where the whispers of witches grew, echoing through the grim cobblestone streets and carried by the howling wind. But friends, this journey won't be easy. Are you ready to uncover the truths hidden behind this dark age? My dear viewers, we are once again stepping into the dark age of the Middle Ages, a time when the fears that had been brewing in the depths of the human mind came to the surface. During this era, the sudden appearance of dark clouds in the sky, the howling winds, and the screams that pierced the night were seen as supernatural signs warning people of an unexplainable danger. It was in this period that the concept of witch began to take shape in the minds of the people. However, the belief in witchcraft was not the product of a single culture or religion. No, it was a culmination of fears and beliefs that had built up over centuries. People have always harbored a fear of the uncontrollable forces of nature. In pagan beliefs, these forces were viewed as spirits, gods, and supernatural beings. From Norse mythology to Celtic legends, figures associated with supernatural powers found a place in the belief systems of every society. Some of these figures eventually evolved into the concept of witch in pagan traditions. There were powerful and wise female figures who knew the healing secrets of nature, followed the cycles of the moon, and unraveled the mysteries of plants. However, this knowledge and power gradually turned into fear. As paganism faded, this wisdom began to be seen as a dangerous mystical power. In the rapidly rising world of Christianity, this kind of knowledge and power was viewed as a threat that challenged the boundaries set by God. In the early days of Christianity, witchcraft was not seen as a major danger, but as the authority of the church strengthened, these beliefs began to change. Especially during the Middle Ages, the church started taking the existence of the devil in the spiritual world much more seriously. At this point, witchcraft was defined as people collaborating with a diabolical power. Pagan rituals, sorcery, and any knowledge intertwined with nature became a danger in the eyes of the church. According to the church's perspective, witches were beings who collaborated with the devil and used his dark powers. Thus, the concept of witchcraft slowly began to infiltrate society. The first witch hunts, of course, were not as widespread and organized as they are today. However, as the Middle Ages approached their end, strange events began to occur in small towns and villages, with people searching for culprits to explain inexplicable illnesses and natural disasters. At this point, the concept of witchcraft transformed into a fear-filled reality. The church began to turn a blind eye to witch hunts as a way to control this fear and strengthen its own authority. Small-scale trials and executions occurred in town squares, with the public observing these horrific events as cautionary tales. In this world where pagan beliefs clashed with Christian dogmas, once the witch hunts began, they became unstoppable. Witchcraft was not just a supernatural threat, it became a way to silence anyone who questioned the authority of the church. During these dark days of the Middle Ages, the fine line between knowledge, power, and belief created a wave of fear among the people. So how did this fear transform into a witch-hunting storm? Here, my friends, is where the roots of the fear of witchcraft begin. But this is just the start. The truly terrifying days were yet to come. My dear listeners, I must remind you that the Black Death, one of the most horrifying periods in human history, didn't just bring about physical death, it also plunged the human mind into a deep darkness. The chilling screams echoing through the streets of Europe during that time were not just the cries of the plague, but also the manifestation of the growing fears within people. These fears unearthed prejudices and superstitions that had long been buried, igniting the fuse for witch accusations. Between 1347 and 1351, the Black Death wiped out nearly a third of Europe. The survivors of this massive catastrophe found themselves on the brink of losing not only their loved ones and social order, but also their sanity. Living with the constant dread of death knocking at their doors, the people were desperately searching for a way out. Was this disease a divine punishment from the heavens, or were these the devil's games? As these questions gnawed at their minds, rumors began to spread about the resurgence of witchcraft and sorcery in villages and cities. During this period, people felt they had completely lost control over their lives. Healers, priests, and even rulers were helpless against the plague. It was at this point that witches started to be blamed. Unable to understand the reasons behind the epidemic, people felt they needed a scapegoat to explain everything they couldn't comprehend. Witches became the targets of this fear. The outbreak of the plague acted like a wind that fanned the flames of witch accusations. When a few people in a village were accused of witchcraft, panic would quickly spread, jumping from village to village, turning into a societal hysteria. In times of societal collapse, especially during such great disasters, trust among people was also shattered. Everyone began to suspect one another. If a neighbor's crops were better than someone else's, then surely they were practicing witchcraft. If disease spread more in one village, that meant witches must be living there. Such thoughts only deepened the despair created by the epidemic. People, whose minds were filled with dark fears, had long since crossed the boundaries of reason. The devastating effects of the Black Death didn't just claim millions of lives, they also tore apart the trust that people had in themselves and each other. In such an environment, witch hunts emerged as a defense mechanism. This fear was even more intense in periods when societal order was completely upended and people lost their sense of security. The societal panic was so powerful that when even one person was accused of witchcraft, the entire village or town would turn against that individual. People were willing to do anything to stop the plague, and that anything often resulted in witch hunts. My dear friends, in these times of collapse, people were fighting not just against the disease, but also against one another. Imagine a world where a neighbor or a relative could be accused of witchcraft at any moment. How terrifying, isn't it? The plague darkened not just the body but the soul as well. This dark period was one of the hottest times for witch hunts. However, this fear would deepen even further, and with the support of the church and the state, witch hunts would become an even greater threat than ever before. The end of these dark days was still far from sight. Now, my dear friends, let me take you back to the dark pages of the Middle Ages. Picture the cold and gloomy days of the 14th and 15th centuries in your mind. Back then in Europe, people believed that supernatural forces were ruling the world, and they wholeheartedly believed that the devil was tempting humans and spreading evil. These fears were fueled not just by the superstitions of the common folk, but also by the declarations issued by the church. The first witch trials began to emerge during this very period. In various villages and towns across Europe, some individuals were being accused of dedicating themselves to the devil. Allegedly, these people gathered under the moonlight at midnight to cast spells, transform into black cats, and utter various curses to disrupt the balance of nature. With diseases, famine, and wars all around, people kept asking the same question: who's responsible for all of this? Those searching for answers quickly turned to witch accusations. But these accusations weren't random. The church had begun to believe in the existence of witches and made it an official doctrine. In 1484, Pope Innocent VIII's famous bull gave a sort of official endorsement to witch hunts. This document, called Summus Desiderantis Effectibus, mandated that witchcraft accusations be taken seriously and that witches be tried. After this declaration, the Church officially recognized the existence of witches and the need for measures against them. They saw witchcraft not just as a threat to God, but also as a threat to society, order, and state authority. My dear friends, witchcraft accusations became more widespread than ever during this time. With the Pope's order, church officials sprang into action to root out witches. At this point, witchcraft accusations were no longer just superstitions but considered a social threat, marking the beginning of the first systematic witch hunts. These hunts were organized rather than based on individual suspicions. The church argued that society needed to be cleansed of these demonic elements, and anything done in that effort was deemed legitimate. Each witch trial was practically a hunting ground for tracking down the devil. Especially in Central European countries like Germany, France, and Switzerland, witch accusations snowballed. Local authorities, with the church's backing, began to put suspected witches, often women and sometimes men, on trial. While these trials may seem ridiculous by today's standards, they were incredibly serious for people back then. Torture methods were used to prove whether a woman was a witch. Techniques like dunking her hands in cold water were terrifying realities for someone trying to prove their innocence. If you didn't sink, you were under the devil's protection, which meant you were a witch. But if you did sink, well, then you were innocent, but you'd still be dead. The underlying belief in these tortures was that witches were hidden. They looked like ordinary people, but were believed to harbor dark powers within. Because of this, no matter how innocent someone appeared, everyone was seen as a potential witch. The church and local authorities established witch courts to investigate these accusations thoroughly, and each trial brought a new wave of fear. My dear friends, these systematic witch hunts had a profound impact on society. People became unable to trust their neighbors. At any moment, they could face a witch accusation and be reported by their closest friends or relatives. Society was practically shaking with the fear of witchcraft. This fear enveloped not just individuals but entire communities. And this process would continue not only during the Middle Ages but also in the centuries to come. But there's so much more to tell. Dear friends, let me tell you about a work that changed the fate of witch hunts, becoming almost a guidebook for those dark days, Malleus Maleficarum. The year 1487 marked a time when the dark clouds over Europe grew heavier, and witch hunts gained significant momentum. That year, a man named Heinrich Kramer published a book on how to fight witches. That book, which we now refer to as the Manual for Witch Hunts, Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of Witches. The impact of this book was so profound. At that time, societal fears, superstitions, and the pressures from the church already weighed heavily on the people. But with this book, Kramer declared that witch hunts were not just a necessity but a duty. Within its pages, he meticulously detailed how to identify witches, how to judge them, and how to punish them. Kramer presented this work, written with the church's approval, as a guide given to humanity by God to combat witchcraft. The details within. Oh dear friends, those details were so terrifying that they spread a great unease even among those who read the book. According to what was described, witches threatened society not just with the forces of nature but with the very help of the devil. These people, who allegedly collaborated with the devil, practiced dark magic, cursed others, and brought illness and death. According to Kramer, the presence of these dark forces existed in every segment of society, and witches hid themselves by appearing as ordinary people. But how did Kramer know how to identify witches? Here's where the scariest part of the book begins. Malleus Maleficarum propagated the idea that women were weaker, making them easier for the devil to deceive. Kramer claimed that women were more prone to becoming witches. As a result, the focus of the witch hunts often landed on women. After the book was published, women accused of witchcraft began to be hunted down in every village and town. The Hammer of Witches didn't just explain how to find witches, it also detailed how they should be judged. Heinrich Kramer believed that proving a witch's innocence was nearly impossible. The book even openly described torture methods to use against witches. It laid out how much pressure could be applied to get a witch to confess, and what forms of torture could be used, presenting this process almost as a holy duty. Oh my friends, this is why Malleus Maleficarum was not just a book, it was a guide that led to the deaths of many innocent people. Dear friends, thanks to this book, witch hunts gained tremendous speed throughout the 15th century and even beyond. Church courts and local authorities began using this book as a judicial guide. The fate of those accused of witchcraft was written in its pages. Kramer's book systematized the methods of witch hunts. In every village and city, women believed to be in the service of the devil were sought out and punished. And the results? Ah, dear listeners, this book created a widespread wave of paranoia across Europe. People were no longer just afraid of diseases, famines, or wars. They began to fear that their neighbors might be witches. Seeds of distrust were sown in every segment of society. A woman's strange behavior, inexplicable illnesses, or even a crop failing to yield were all suddenly linked to witchcraft. People started to believe they faced bad luck because of witches. Knowing that anyone could be accused of witchcraft at any moment instilled a deep fear and paranoia within society. This fear and paranoia grew so intense that by the time people realized witch hunts needed to be stopped, hundreds of thousands had been accused, tried, and often executed by burning. The book written by Heinrich Kramer led to the tragic fate of many innocent lives. Malleus Maleficarum thus left its mark on the most horrific periods of witch hunts and became a dark stain in history. Ah, but our story doesn't end here, my friends. The traces of these dark days would not be erased for centuries. Ah, my dear friends, now we're stepping into perhaps one of the darkest and most ruthless chapters of history. In the 16th century, we witnessed the horrifying rise of witch hunts across many corners of Europe. It was a century where witch hunts swept through the lands of Germany, Switzerland, and France like a storm, dragging countless innocent people along with them. Churches and governments became the very agents of this terrible oppression. But how did these hunts gain such momentum? Let's explore together how this dark period became so destructive. First, we need to look at Germany, my friends. Germany became one of the central hubs of witch hunts in the 16th century. This region in particular was home to some of Europe's bloodiest witch trials. Ironically, the most intense witch hunts occurred during a time of religious reform and significant changes in the Christian world. Both Protestant and Catholic areas had extremely harsh witch hunting policies. The fragmentation of beliefs, religious conflicts, and social unrest made witch accusations a kind of outlet for people. They found a way to relieve their fears, anger, unexplained events, and disasters by blaming witches. Thus, witch hunts turned into a form of social catharsis, a means of purification. Cities like Trier, Würzburg, and Bamberg hosted some of the largest witch trials in history. Ah, my dear friends, you wouldn't believe what went on in these cities. In the courts of Trier, around 360 people were tried as witches, and most were executed by burning. In Bamberg and Würzburg, the witch hunts spread like an epidemic. The witch trials in these areas targeted not just peasants but also nobles, priests, and even children. In fact, during these trials, some of the accused were merely a few months old. The accusation of witchcraft became so common that people began to fear that their neighbors, relatives, or anyone who seemed to bring bad luck could be witches. So how were these trials conducted? Governments and churches managed witch hunts with great care and in a systematic manner. Courts often operated with the approval of the church and the support of the state. The Catholic Church, in particular, took witchcraft accusations seriously. State authorities recognized that witch trials could be used as a tool to maintain order and prevent uprisings among the public. Consequently, both the church and the state began to promote witch hunts for their own interests. The methods used during the witch trials in Germany were inhumane. My dear friends, the torture methods used in these courts loomed over people like a dark shadow. The accused were forced to confess to being witches, and many innocent people, unable to withstand the pain of torture, felt they had no choice but to admit it. This had become a vicious cycle. When one person was accused of witchcraft, they were often pressured to name other supposed witches who had helped them. Thus, the accusations multiplied in a chain reaction, broadening the scope of the hunts. When we look at France, we see that witch hunts also spread in a similar manner. In particular, the witch trials in southeastern France were conducted with great diligence. By the late 16th century, witch hunts in France became more systematic. In various regions of the country, hunts led by courts created a wave of fear among peasants. One of the most famous witch hunts in France, the Loudun witch trial, took place during this period. Priests and government officials in the town used witchcraft accusations to protect their personal interests. This trial is one of the clearest examples of how accusations of witchcraft were used to bolster the power of the church. My dear friends, Switzerland also fell victim to witch hunts. In the rural areas of Switzerland, witch hunts spread rapidly. Witchcraft accusations were used by local authorities as a tool for controlling the peasants. In these quiet Swiss villages, accusations of witchcraft led to family breakdowns, village disintegration, and deepening social unrest. The Jura region, in particular, became one of the places most heavily affected by witch hunts. During this time, governments and churches viewed witch hunts as a means of maintaining social balance. Witch accusations were employed to uphold social order, direct public fears toward a target, and reinforce the power of religious authorities. However, my dear listeners, the fear generated by these hunts deeply shook the fabric of society. People were no longer just afraid of natural disasters, wars, or diseases. They lived in fear that their neighbors or even their closest family members could be witches. The 16th century became a peak period for witch hunts. Governments and churches transformed these hunts into systematic tools of oppression. Those accused in courts were often left defenseless, tortured into confession, and ultimately sacrificed for the sake of societal peace. Thousands of people across Europe fell victim to these witch hunts. My dear friends, the pain and tragedies of this period left indelible marks for centuries. But the end of this dark age had yet to come. My dear friends, now I'm taking you to the northern parts of Europe, to Scotland and England, where misty hills, dark castles, and terrifying nights reigned. In the 16th and 17th centuries, these two lands fell under the grip of witch hunts, and people found themselves facing accusations of witchcraft. But the hunts in these lands took on a different, more savage and frightening nature compared to those in other European countries. In Scotland, witch hunts almost turned into a form of social madness. Let's start with England. My dear friends, the history of witch hunts in England began to intensify during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. These were years when England was striving to maintain its religious and political stability. However, alongside this quest for stability, the fear of witchcraft among the people was rapidly growing. By the late 16th century, during Elizabeth's rule, laws regarding witchcraft tightened, and there was a harsher crackdown on witches. With the Witchcraft Act of 1563, being a witch or practicing magic became punishable by death. Just think, my friends, about how a simple peasant woman, an old lady, or someone just ostracized by society could be declared a witch, leading to the end of her life in those days. In Elizabethan England, witchcraft was seen as a reflection of religious and social issues. While the Reformation brought about significant changes in the Christian world, increasing religious tensions and fears among the populace further fueled the witch hunts. People began to view witchcraft as a threat to the church and the monarchy. Women accused of witchcraft were often victims of social unrest. Women who were ostracized in their villages, lived alone, or appeared different in any way were brought to trial on witchcraft charges and frequently found guilty. Tragically, these accusations often lacked any solid evidence and were based solely on rumors and gossip. But my dear friends, the truly horrific dimension of witch hunts was reached in Scotland. Scotland's cold and gloomy lands became one of the most intense sites of witch hunts. The witch hunts in Scotland were much harsher and more brutal than in England. One of the main reasons for this was the turbulence in Scotland's religious and social structure. By the late 16th century and early 17th century, Scotland was experiencing the deep effects of the Protestant Reformation. During this period, kings adopted an even stricter stance against witchcraft. King James VI of Scotland, in particular, was obsessed with witchcraft and believed that witches posed a significant threat to his kingdom. James VI realized that witch hunts could be used as both a religious and political weapon. Friends, this is where the witch hunts in Scotland became more than just a religious or social issue. They turned into a tool to strengthen the power of the monarchy. King James's work, Demonology, which he wrote about witchcraft, laid the theoretical groundwork for the witch hunts in Scotland. This work established a strong belief that witches collaborated with the devil and disrupted the moral order of society. Those accused of witchcraft were tortured into confessing, often revealing the names of other supposed witches they had collaborated with. This led to a snowball effect in the witch hunts. When one person was declared a witch, many people around them were often implicated as well. The most intense period of witch hunts in Scotland took place between 1590 and 1660, especially during the early years of King James VI's reign. From 1590 to 1597, the witch hunts reached their peak. During this time, hundreds of people were tried on witchcraft charges, and many were executed. My dear friends, one of the most famous of these witch hunts, the North Berwick case, became a symbol of King James's fight against witchcraft. In this case, a group of people was accused of practicing witchcraft to endanger King James's sea voyage. Under torture, many confessed to engaging in witchcraft and were executed. But my friends, the witch hunts didn't just exert pressure on ordinary people, they also became a significant tool of oppression for the nobility. In Scotland, accusations of witchcraft were used as a weapon against political rivals. In any political or religious dispute, those wanting to eliminate their opponents could accuse them of being witches. This created an atmosphere of great fear and distrust among not just the common folk, but also the nobles and clergy. In England and Scotland, the witch hunts continued until the mid-17th century. However, over time, with the rise of rationalism and scientific thought, belief in witch hunts began to wane. Yet, my dear friends, the end of this period had not yet arrived. Just like in other parts of Europe, the witch hunts in Scotland and England profoundly impacted societies. The combination of social fears, religious beliefs, and political games led to the deaths of thousands of innocent people in these two countries. My friends, the tragedies left in the wake of these witch hunts will echo through the ages, becoming the stuff of legends. But we mustn't forget that the end of these dark days would eventually come. Ah, my dear friends. Now I'm taking you to Salem, a small, dark town in the American colonies across the ocean. The year is 1692. The shadows of fear and panic from the witch hunts had spread across Europe, and the winds carried them to the shores of America along with the Atlantic waves. One of the darkest and most tragic events in American history unfolded here, the Salem witch trials. These events in Salem became one of the most striking examples of how deep fears, beliefs, and uncertainties within a community can lead to disaster. Salem was a small town in Massachusetts. The people living there were mostly farmers, devout, and adhered to strict moral codes. However, a series of events that shook the town in 1692 deeply impacted not just Salem but all the American colonies. It all started with a group of young girls exhibiting sudden and bizarre behavior. These girls would suddenly collapse, convulse, lose consciousness, and make strange noises. The people of that time quickly sought an explanation for these odd occurrences. Witches were at work. Ah, friends, imagine. In 1692, this community believed in the presence of God and the devil in every moment of life. Every misfortune, every calamity was thought to be the result of the devil's influence. The girls' suffering had to be the work of some kind of magic or witchcraft. So the people of Salem began to search for a culprit. They concluded that witches were behind the girls' symptoms, and accusations started flying. The first ones accused were typically the most vulnerable individuals in society: the homeless, elderly women, and those who were not well liked in the community. These people were brought to trial on witchcraft charges. The witch trials in Salem represented much more than a simple quest for justice. Deeply rooted fears, old grudges, and endless conflicts overshadowed these cases. Families carrying old resentments against each other began accusing their neighbors of witchcraft. The situation spiraled out of control. Nearly everyone in Salem began to suspect one another. Friends, many of those accused during these trials were forced to confess they were witches, despite being innocent. Torture, coercion, false statements. People started accusing even their closest ones to survive. This tragedy in Salem quickly transformed into a massive wave of paranoia. About 200 people were accused of witchcraft and 19 were executed for it. Ah, dear friends, these executions were not just individual tragedies. They left deep societal wounds in Salem and across the colonies. Those people were merely victims of society's fears and ignorance. However, behind these trials lay deeper social and psychological issues. The mass hysteria in Salem erupted at the intersection of religious beliefs, social pressures, and psychological fears. So why did such hysteria occur in Salem? Why did this small town host one of the most famous witch trials in history? Friends, several factors came together here. First of all, Salem was under immense social pressure at that time. Famine, wars, and epidemics were shaking the town. In this uncertainty, people began searching for a scapegoat. At the same time, there was a significant economic and class divide within the town. The witch accusations reflected these class differences. Wealthy families blamed the poor farmers, began to rebel against landowners. These events in Salem were also indicative of a significant psychological collapse in the American colonies. Life in the New World was tough and filled with uncertainties. People saw dangers lurking around every corner. One of these dangers was supernatural forces. The witch hunts were, in fact, an expression of these fears. People began to point fingers at witches as the cause of all their pains, struggles, and fears. Ah, friends, what a grave mistake. What a tremendous tragedy. But these events didn't just stay within the confines of the Salem trials. The psychological effects of the Salem witch trials left deep scars in American society for years. These trials were a process of confronting not only witches but also the deep conflicts within the community. As societies faced their fears and ignorance, they realized that they could prevent such tragedies from happening again. Perhaps the greatest lesson to be learned from Salem is this: a society blinded by fear can destroy even its most innocent members. My friends, the Salem witch trials ended in 1693. The accusations were dropped, and the survivors were set free. However, looking back, the pain and losses caused by these trials were never forgotten. Salem continues to be remembered not only in American history but also in world history as one of the most horrific examples of witch hunts. Ah, what a painful history, what a dark period. And so, dear friends, the lesson we should take from this tragedy in Salem is about how societies can act out of fear and hysteria throughout history. These events are not just a story from the past, they serve as a warning about whether humanity learns from its mistakes. Under the dark shadows of Salem, we must remember that such tragedies should never happen again. Ah, my dear friends, now I want to introduce you to one of the most ruthless and terrifying figures of the witch hunts. A name written in the darkest pages of history: Matthew Hopkins. In the grim days of 17th century England, this man sowed the seeds of fear among the people and earned himself the title of Witchfinder General, taking the lives of innocent people. As the cruel face of witch hunts in England, Hopkins was a figure who tracked down witches, interrogated them mercilessly, and ultimately condemned them to death. Matthew Hopkins emerged during the years of civil war in England. The chaos, hunger, and epidemics brought on by the war plunged the people into deep despair. In such times, people turned their eyes to supernatural forces to understand the reasons behind their hardships. A drought in one village, a disease in another. Witches were sought behind them all. In this environment, Hopkins capitalized on these fears to rise to power. Hopkins turned witch hunting into a profession, branding himself an expert at identifying witches. He played a significant role in the witch hunts concentrated in the eastern regions of England, particularly in Essex and Suffolk. So how did this man find witches, you ask? Ah, my dear friends, his methods were so brutal and cruel that it's hard to comprehend. Hopkins' most infamous method involved tying the hands and feet of women suspected of witchcraft and throwing them into water. If a woman floated, it was considered proof that she was a witch. This was based on the belief that witches would be rejected by water. However, if the woman sank, she was deemed innocent, but tragically, that innocence often led to death. Hopkins' cruel methods cost many innocent women their lives. Matthew Hopkins didn't stop with just the water test. Searching for witch marks, or what was known as the devil's mark, on the bodies of suspects was also one of his favorite techniques. A woman with a strange spot, wart, or blemish on her skin would be branded as a witch. These marks were believed to be evidence of a witch's pact with the devil. Another cruel method he employed was the torture of sleep deprivation. Women kept awake for days on end, both physically and mentally exhausted, would ultimately confess to being witches. Ah, my friends, what a grave injustice. Hopkins' witch hunting lasted only a few years, but in that short time, it led to the execution of over 300 people accused of witchcraft. This was one of the largest witch hunts in English history. The social and economic conditions of the time paved the way for figures like Hopkins to take the stage. The despair, helplessness, and fears of the people led them to see him as a hero. However, in the eyes of history, Hopkins is no different from a murderer. But Matthew Hopkins was not alone. Witch hunters like him emerged all over Europe. In Germany, France, Scotland, each claimed to find witches using the same fear and ignorance-based methods. Manuals like Malleus Maleficarum, written by Heinrich Kramer in Germany, became weapons in the hands of witch hunters. Kramer attempted to give witch hunts a scientific appearance, further fueling social fears with his book. Every witch hunter followed Kramer's lead, deepening society's dark fears. My dear friends, The prevalence of witch hunts wasn't solely due to individuals. Churches, governments, and the public played significant roles in this process. Behind the major witch hunts in Europe often lay the encouragement of religious authorities and local leaders. Societies sought ways to eliminate their enemies using this atmosphere of fear. This wave of fear spread everywhere in Germany, France, and Scotland. Across Europe, witch hunters became legendary figures. In Scotland, witch hunts began long before Matthew Hopkins. In the dark mountains and misty valleys of Scotland, legends of witches have been told for centuries. During the reign of Queen Mary Stuart, these hunts became ingrained in the populace. Scotland became one of the places where witch hunts were most mercilessly carried out. Approximately 4,000 women were tortured, interrogated, and executed on charges of witchcraft. This massive witch hunt was even more brutal than Hopkins' methods. My dear friends, even though witch hunters became figures in the dark corners of history, the true powers behind the scenes were the societal and religious structures that promoted this cruelty. As churches defined witchcraft as heresy and collaboration with the devil, governments used witch accusations as a tool to direct public anger. The fear, ignorance, and desire to blame present in people led to the empowerment of these ruthless hunters. Matthew Hopkins and witch hunters like him were the main perpetrators of the greatest injustices throughout history. However, we must not forget that they merely brought the fears within society to the surface. The innocent people hunted by Hopkins were victims not only of his cruelty but also of the blind beliefs that resided in the hearts of the people. And so, my friends, there are many lessons to learn from these brutal pages of witch hunts. We must never forget how ignorance, fear, and hatred can lead to immense destruction. Hopkins and other witch hunters revealed humanity's darkest fears throughout history. But they also taught us how to confront these fears. These hunters sacrificed not just individuals but also the dignity of humanity. My dear friends, let us remember that recalling these dark pages of history serves as a great warning to prevent such tragedies from ever happening again. Matthew Hopkins and his ilk will not be forgotten in the dusty shelves of history. They will remain symbols reminding us of humanity's deepest mistakes. Ah, dear friends, are you ready to embark on a journey from the dark days of history into the light of human reason? The dark times of witch hunts, fueled by humanity's deepest fears and ignorance, were finally coming to an end. But it wasn't easy. This wave of oppression, which cost the lives of thousands of innocents over centuries, only began to wane with the rise of human reason and scientific thought. Let me tell you how the Enlightenment put an end to these horrific witch hunts. By the late 17th century, an intellectual awakening was sweeping across Europe. People were looking up at the stars, trying to understand nature, and questioning how the world worked. We were entering a time when Galileo looked into the depths of the universe with his telescope, and Newton discovered universal laws by watching apples fall. This era would be known as the Enlightenment. As the dark veil of ignorance began to lift, and the human mind was spreading its wings toward freedom. So how did this wave of new thinking affect the witch hunts, you ask? Ah, my friends, you should know this first. The scientific and intellectual developments of the Enlightenment prompted people to question the long-held beliefs about witchcraft and the supernatural. Once illnesses, bad weather, and misfortunes were blamed on witches, but scientific thought started to uncover the real causes behind these events. Learning that epidemic diseases spread due to microscopic organisms revealed the absurdity of blaming an innocent woman for all the disasters in a village. However, my friends, this change didn't happen overnight. The Enlightenment was like a slowly spreading light. In the beginning, only a few brave intellectuals and scientists dared to question the existence of witchcraft. By the late 17th century, Dutch lawyer Johann Weyer argued that the witch hunts were unjust, claiming that witches were actually sick and in need of help. This bold idea was an important step toward dismantling the fears of that era. Weyer raised the voice of reason by stating that witches suffered from mental illnesses rather than being in league with the devil. But such ideas were not widely accepted at first. Nevertheless, it was a spark of hope. As we entered the 18th century, the voices of Enlightenment thinkers began to grow louder. Philosophers like Voltaire, Rousseau, and Diderot argued that reason and science should guide every aspect of human life. Voltaire ridiculed the religious dogmas and superstitions of his time, highlighting the harm ignorance inflicted on humanity. Rousseau challenged the malicious prejudices behind witch accusations, advocating for the inherent goodness of human nature. These philosophers became champions not just of science but of human rights as well. Gradually, these ideas began to spread to broader sections of society. Scientific advancements also gained momentum during this time. Major strides in medicine, psychology, astronomy, physics, and chemistry empowered scientists who questioned supernatural beliefs like witchcraft. People were learning that events on Earth were explained by scientific laws rather than supernatural forces. Galileo's observations of the stars, Newton's discovery of the laws of gravity, and Descartes' famous phrase, "One think, therefore I am," helped free humanity from its dark fears. Reason and science began to erase the long-standing shadow of witchcraft. But dear friends, the end of the witch hunts was influenced not only by scientific developments, but also by social and legal changes. European states began to remove witch accusations from the legal agenda through legal reforms. After the Salem witch trials in 1692, there was a serious backlash against witch hunts even in the American colonies. People started to realize that the innocent were being killed due to fear and ignorance. States gradually began to recognize that witch accusations were no longer acceptable. In France, Louis XIV and the governments that followed banned trials based on witchcraft accusations. Similar steps were taken in Germany and England. Courts shifted from believing in witch accusations to establishing a more rational and fair legal system. A new understanding of human rights was developing, and justice systems began to be based on transparency and scientific foundations. Dear friends, the end of the witch hunts was not just the closing of a chapter, it marked the beginning of humanity's quest for a more rational and just world. The Enlightenment became historic not only for its scientific revolutions, but also for its social progress. People were now raising their voices louder against ignorance, superstition, and oppression. Beliefs in witchcraft slowly faded into the dusty pages of history under the pressure of scientific and intellectual developments. Friends, remember that humanity is always moving toward progress, learning, and a brighter future. The end of the witch hunts is a testament to the triumph of human reason. However, it is essential to remember and learn from this dark past. We must recognize how ignorance, fear, and hatred can lead societies to great destruction. The Enlightenment is not just a period, it is a revolution of thought, and this revolution should always be our guiding light. So, my friends, that is the story behind the end of the witch hunts. Science and reason, fighting against ignorance, superstition, and darkness, ultimately prevailed. Humanity took a step toward a fairer and more peaceful world with this victory. Ah, my friends, when the witch trials came to an end, the world took a huge sigh of relief, but that sigh was still filled with pain. The centuries of witch hunts and trials left deep scars on the collective memory. So how did this horrific past impact societies? And how does the modern world view these dreadful events? Let me share with you the traces left behind by the witch hunts and their lasting effects on communities. Dear friends, with the end of the witch hunts, people in Europe and America slowly started questioning the effects of this dark past. However, the deep wounds from those days didn't heal overnight. These hunts didn't just take the lives of thousands of innocent women, men, and even children, they also profoundly shook the social fabric. The brutality born from fear, paranoia, and ignorance uprooted the trust communities had in themselves. Those who turned in their neighbors, those who lost their families, had to rebuild their faith in society and their sense of unity over many years. The community lost trust in the justice system and its leaders. The witch accusations not only targeted individuals but also tarnished the understanding of justice upheld by the state and the church. The years of trials revealed that not only was justice disregarded, but so were human rights. The way leaders and religious figures exploited these fears left a deep wound in society's memory. The effects of this period lingered not only in the justice system, but also in people's trust in one another. However, my friends, with the end of the witch hunts, societies slowly began to confront this painful past. In modern times, people started holding memorials to ensure that the dark events of the past wouldn't be forgotten and that lessons would be learned. The town of Salem in America, in particular, became a central hub for such remembrances. Annual events in Salem aimed to honor the memory of the innocents tried in the unjust witch trials. Once a symbol of fear and oppression, Salem has now transformed into a symbol of peace, justice, and tolerance. In today's world, perspectives on witchcraft and witch hunts have changed dramatically. People now understand how baseless and harmful these beliefs were. Science continues to illuminate society, taking the place of supernatural beliefs. However, my friends, there are still parts of the world where witch accusations and superstitions persist. In certain regions of Africa and among some isolated communities, lives are still threatened by witchcraft allegations. This reminds us that ignorance and fear remain humanity's greatest enemies. In our current world, witchcraft is no longer seen as an accusation, but rather as an identity and a tradition in many cultures. Modern witchcraft movements, like neo-paganism and Wicca, offer people the chance to connect with nature, preserve ancient wisdom, and promote peace. These modern witch communities emerged as a response to the dark days of the past, aiming to carry on old beliefs with a more peaceful and contemporary approach. Today, these communities hold a different significance. No one is blaming witches anymore. Instead, they are seen as part of a culture and a connection to nature. Dear friends, the witch hunts and trials are among the darkest pages in history. However, these dark pages have taught us to learn from the mistakes of the past and to strive for a fairer world in the future. The world has changed significantly since the witch trials. People have started to embrace justice, science, and tolerance more openly. The modern world has managed to emerge from the darkness of the witch hunts and walk toward the light of enlightenment and justice. Let's not forget, dear friends, that history always teaches us a lesson. Ignorance and fear can lead humanity to the darkest places, but reason and science can dispel the darkness. The lasting effects left behind by the witch hunts remind us that we must always stay vigilant. They show us how easily societies can crumble under ignorance and fear, but also how they can be rebuilt through reason and justice. So, my friends, the traces left by the end of the witch hunts serve as a warning that echoes all the way to the modern world. This painful history must not be forgotten. My friends, we've deeply explored one of the darkest and most frightening chapters of history, the years overshadowed by the witch hunts. History sometimes blows through us like a chilling wind, and at other times it warms and enlightens us, much like gathering around a fire. Today, while we recall those cold days, we've also felt the sweet warmth of enlightenment. The ignorance and fear of societies chasing after witches shaped their future. But we must remember, after every dark night the sun rises, and from every mistake there's a lesson to be learned. Dear friends, the witch hunts didn't just erode trust among people and belief in justice, they also held up a mirror to history. This mirror showed us the past, revealed our mistakes, and taught us that we need to stay vigilant. While witch hunts may have ended in our world today, the scars of the past still sometimes touch our lives without us even realizing it. The fears, prejudices, and doubts people feel about the unknown have led to many tragedies throughout history. That's why, my friends, learning history is not just a necessity, it's a responsibility. The Enlightenment that followed the end of the witch hunts rebuilt societies with the light of science. However, one thing we all must remember is that dark days never completely fade away. If we haven't learned our lessons, they may knock on our doors again. We tell these stories so that the greatest tragedies we've faced throughout human history don't happen again. The most important lesson history teaches us is that we can overcome ignorance and fear with reason and science. Today I shared with you the story of the deep fears and pains behind the witch hunts. But remember, history is not just a record of the past, it also serves as a guide for today and tomorrow. Whether in the Middle Ages or in the modern world, people will always make mistakes. What's important is to learn from these mistakes and take steps toward a fairer, brighter future. Because, my friends, even though we carry the weight of the past, it is in our hands to open the doors of hope for the future. Finally, I want to share a little secret with you. History is always like a cycle. We learn from that cycle, correct our mistakes, and try to leave a better world for the next generations. But to avoid breaking this cycle, we must keep walking in the light of history, continuously learning and understanding. The witch hunts may have ended, but we need to remember, commemorate, and never forget them. Forgetting is one of the greatest mistakes we've made throughout history. So, my friends, we've come to the end of another journey. History is a guide that makes us both sad and thoughtful. Today we turn the pages of those dark chapters together, and I hope this story has inspired you, just as it has inspired me, to seek a brighter future. Until we meet again in the next story, let's continue to follow the traces of history and strive to understand these profound teachings. Because history still has so much to teach all of us. Take care, and see you in the next story, dear friends.